Wallace, Idaho. The town of Wallace is located in Shoshone County, Idaho, 48 miles from Coeur d'Alene and 13 miles from the border with Montana. It was founded in 1884 and today has a population of just under 800 people. The history of Wallace began in 1882, when gold and silver were discovered in a small mountain stream a few miles outside where the town would eventually be developed. Hoping to strike rich, settlers quickly flooded into the surrounding areas. And within a year, communities like Eagle City, Pritchard, and Murray were founded. In the spring of 1884, a farmer and Civil War veteran named William R. Wallace came to the area, purchased 80 acres of land, and built a cabin. Knowing that gold and silver would cause an economic explosion, Wallace built his cabin on a specific location that drew in miners and businessmen. Wallace became fully invested on the area to be turned into a town, and by 1886, the original 80 acres had developed into a large mining town with multiple buildings and roads, and had a population of over 500. In 1889, despite the town's success, William Wallace faced quite the hardship. Rumor had spread that Wallace purchased the land using Sioux script, which was considered invalid. This led to a dispute over the legitimacy of the property titles of those who had purchased land from Wallace. This issue eventually led to the U.S. Congress getting involved. Though never fully confirmed, this incident caused land ownership disputes that lasted for years. Many people believe that it was these allegations that led Wallace to leave the town and live in California. William Wallace eventually died in 1901 at the age of 67. And despite the legal issues, he was still quite the pioneer and responsible for the birth of one of America's most unique towns. Despite never growing into a larger city, Wallace was still a major mining town. By 1887, railroads, mills, and smelters had been built, which made the mining industry and the transportation of ore more efficient. By the 1890s, Wallace was one of the richest cities in the West and was the leading producer of silver in the Union, earning it the name, the Silver Capital of the World. However, the 1890s were also a time of struggle. In the summer of 1892, a major strike had erupted. Union miners had begun to protest about wage reductions and increased working hours. At first, these protests were peaceful, but eventually it turned into a violent riot, which led to the deaths of 7 miners and dozens of others injured. This riot led the Idaho state governor to enforce martial law, which lasted for 4 months. By the time it was over 600 workers were arrested and over a dozen mines had been shut down. In 1893, the Western Federation of Miners was formed. This union ensured the protection of miners all across the country and strengthened their bargaining power with the mine owners. Wallace and the surrounding towns have produced a lot of ore. Silver and gold are still taken out of the mines near the town today, and since mining began in 1884, over 1 billion ounces of silver have been mined, and the total value of precious metals produced exceeds over $6 billion. In 1890, a fire had burnt down a few of the town's timber buildings. After this fire, hoping to prevent future loss, the buildings were rebuilt out of brick. But in 1910, one of the worst fires ever known had occurred. and no one could have predicted the level of destruction. In August of 1910, a massive wildfire had spread across over 3 million acres, stretching from eastern Washington to western Montana, and the town of Wallace, along with several other Idaho towns, were caught right in the middle. By the time the fire was done, over 1/3 of the entire town was completely destroyed. Over 7 billion board feet of timber were burned, along with over 150 homes and a railway station. The total cost of damages was estimated at over $1 million, equivalent to over $30 million today. And sadly, 87 people had lost their lives, 78 of which were firefighters. This terrible fire is now known as the Great Burn of 1910, and it was the largest and most destructive wildfire in U.S. history. Then just 3 years later, another disaster had struck. In the spring of 1913, an unusually high amount of rainfall caused the rivers nearby to rise to a dangerous level. The streets of Wallace and other smaller towns close by were completely flooded. But fortunately, no lives were lost and the costs of damages were small. The only casualty from this flood was the Northern Pacific Railway engine number 79 that was swept off the tracks and slightly buried in the mud. By the end of World War II, mining had slowed and the population began to decline. At its peak, Wallace had a population of around 4,000. By the 1950s, it had dropped by nearly half, but it continued to be a popular town amongst tourists and entrepreneurs. In 1956, the U.S. interstate highway system began construction. Interstate 90, which would eventually become the second longest highway in the country, was set to cross right through the center of the town. Fearing the town's destruction, efforts were made by local government officials to protect the town. In 1966, as part of the National Preservation Act, the National Register of Historic Places was established, and by the 1970s, several American towns had been placed within the registry. Businessman Harry F. Magnuson played a key role in the preservation of Wallace. Magnuson sued the Federal Highway Administration and the Idaho Transportation Department, claiming that they had failed to file a statement regarding the environmental impact. A judge had concurred with this claim and filed an injunction halting the construction of Interstate 90 until an agreement was met. Eventually, an agreement was met. Instead of demolishing the town and having the interstate pass right through it, an overpass was constructed on the northern side of the town. For both sides, this was a win-win. The interstate had been built and the town was saved. In honor of the man who saved the town, the 1.7-mile-long stretch of highway that was the original interstate route was renamed the Harry F. Magnuson Way. And then, in 1979, Wallace was placed into the Registry of National Historic Places. In 2004, Wallace was officially declared the center of the universe. This unprovable proclamation was made by the town's mayor, who used the principle that if something cannot be fully proven or disproven, it must be true. Ever since, a marked manhole cover in the middle of downtown has been placed, pinpointing the exact location of the center of the universe. Wallace, Idaho is one of America's most unique little towns. It's full of history, and despite its small size, has had a monumental impact on the development of the western half of the country. It's a quiet, peaceful town. The locals are friendly and welcoming. The crime rate is low and it's surprisingly affordable. 80 minutes from Spokane, in the northern Bitterroot Mountains, just off Interstate 90, lies a hidden gem. Wallace, Idaho.